Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our staff devotions. Today is Thursday, April the 30th, and it was on this day in the year 311 that the Roman Emperor Galerius issued the Edict of Toleration, which effectively ended the active persecution of Christians in the Roman Empire. It was also the day in 2009 when Chrysler filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. We are in Mark chapter 14, verses 53 through 65 this morning. We've seen Jesus was praying in the garden with his disciples, and then Judas comes with a large group of soldiers and chief priests and scribes. They arrest him and they bring him to the high priest. So verse 53 picks up the story. Again, this is late Thursday night, early Friday morning, maybe somewhere around 12:30, 1 a.m. And they led Jesus to the high priest. This is Mark 14:53. And all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And Peter followed them at a distance right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself by the fire. Now we can see that Peter, who was very ambitious in the garden, is now a bit more cautious. He still wants to be close to the action, but he's following at a bit of a distance at this point. Please don't tempt me to make a social distancing joke at this point, because I will. Verse 55 says, "Now the chief priests and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. And some stood up and bore false witness against Jesus, saying, 'We heard him say, I will destroy this temple made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands.' Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree." So what's going on here at the high priest's house seems to be less of a trial and more of a preliminary hearing to establish the charges against Jesus. Still, this whole scene is an embarrassment of justice. First, the hearing takes place in the middle of the night with no one to come to Jesus' defense and testify on his behalf. Second, no two witnesses could agree about exactly what claims Jesus had made during his earthly ministry. Some of the things they were accusing Jesus of were downright absurd. For example, Jesus never came close to saying that he would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, as some of the witnesses had claimed in verse 58. This whole thing was a complete fiasco. And you know what? In the middle of all the chaos, Jesus kept his composure and remained calm and quiet. This frustrated the high priest, who wanted results from this hearing. And so in verse 60, the high priest stood up in the middle of everyone and asked Jesus, "Have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you?" But Jesus remained silent and made no answer. You see, Jesus knew he didn't have to say a word because the testimony against him was contradictory and proved absolutely nothing about Jesus' claims. But the high priest wouldn't stop. He continued pressing Jesus, possibly trying to elicit a violent reaction of some kind. Again, the high priest asked him, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" Now remember in Mark 1, those were the two things that Mark wanted us to know about Jesus. The two things that Jesus claimed throughout his ministry is that he is Israel's Messiah and he is the Son of God come in human flesh. And so the high priest asks him directly. And finally, Jesus responds. Now his response is packed with allusions to the Old Testament scriptures. Look at verse 62. "And Jesus said, I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven." So let's unpack Jesus' answer a little bit. First of all, when Jesus said the two words, "I am," he was clearly identifying himself as the God who had appeared to Moses in Exodus at the burning bush. When Moses asked God, "What should I tell people when they ask me what your name is? How should I respond?" And God said, "I am who I am. Tell the people, the I am has sent you." Second, Jesus refers to himself as the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven, which is a direct reference to the God-man that we find in Daniel chapter 7, who receives full authority from the Ancient of Days, who is sitting on his heavenly throne. Finally, the reference to sitting at the right hand of power is an allusion to Psalm 110, where the eternal Father says to the divine Son of David, "Sit at my right hand until I make all of your enemies your footstool." Now, Jesus' words, although not totally clear to us as 21st century American readers, were not lost on the council members on that night. They knew exactly what Jesus was saying. He was claiming to be Israel's Messiah, and once again, the divine Son of God come in human flesh. Verse 63, the high priest then tore his garments and said, "What further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision?" And they all condemned Jesus as deserving death. Now here, the leaders make one fatal assumption. You see, despite all of Jesus' miracles, and all of the wisdom that they heard and saw in his parables and in his teachings of the people, despite everything that Jesus had done the past 3.5 years in his public ministry, these men assumed that he was lying and that he wasn't really the eternal Son of God. As a result, they condemned Jesus of Nazareth to execution by Roman cross. They would need to wait, of course, until the morning before they approached Pontius Pilate about carrying out the execution. And since that was hours away, they needed to find something to do. What are they going to do in the meantime? It's the middle of the night. None of them are ready for sleep. Look at verse 65. And some of these council members began to spit on Jesus and to cover his face and strike him, saying, "Prophesy." So what's going on here is that Jesus, throughout his ministry, has been making these prophetic utterances. And these men think it would be fun to play a little game. Let's put a blindfold over his eyes, and let's randomly come up to him as he's sitting bound in his chair, and let's punch him as hard as we can in the face. Then let's ask him to prophesy, what's the name of the person who just punched you? They're mocking him, they're spitting on him, because they were done with his ministry. It would be a few hours that Jesus would have to endure this, and then he would be delivered over to Pontius Pilate the next morning, and the Roman guards would even do worse things to him. And that's what our next video will be all about. But in the meantime, consider our Lord's suffering for us. He clearly viewed himself as the suffering servant in Isaiah 53. As a lamb before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. By his wounds we are healed. And it was this suffering that ultimately secured our eternal salvation. So go in that thought and have a great day.